Tonight's lesson will be related to lookup and reference functions, which can be extremely useful if you properly set up data which you want to extract some information from. In this example, what I'm using for data is on the Pivot Data tab. If you go to that sheet, you'll see that there are a few different tables here, all with video games and their scores. Metacritic is a site that aggregates scores from different websites, and user score is users on the site voting for it. So I have a few named ranges here. Metacritic table 1, which includes the rank, Metacritic table 2, which is just off the name, and Metacritic table 3, which is a transposed version of the table. And I'll show you where all these come into play soon. But first we'll be using a VLOOKUP formula. We touched on this in the last lesson, but I'll go into it in a bit more depth. VLOOKUPs are used quite frequently, and it's a really easy way to pull out some data from data that's set up in the normal format where you're pulling something from a column, and then you want to find something that is within that data table but a certain amount of columns to the right of that. So for this we're going to look at Grand Theft Auto 4, and we're going to try to pull the Metascore from the other tab. So the way we set up the VLOOKUP formula, it says lookup value, so which value you want to look up, and that's going to be whatever's in this lookup value box. And so Grand Theft Auto 4. Table array is Metacritic table, and you'll see it already starts listing the tables that I already have named. So I'll pick table 2 because that has the name of the game in the left hand column, and so whatever you're looking up, the table you're looking up in, it needs to be in the left hand column. And then the column index number, which is the next piece, is how many columns to the right of that do you want to pull your data from. And so I'm going to pick 2 so I can get the Metascore because it's the next column over, and then you can either put true or false. True is an approximate match, and that's good if you have data that's in alphabetical format, but I would always use false unless you have a very complicated spreadsheet, because it really only helps to do true if you have massive spreadsheets and you're trying to save on calculation time. So typically I would say to always use false. And so it's going to pull the score for Grand Theft Auto 4. And if we look at the pivot table here, Grand Theft Auto 4, we can see it has a 98. And so that's the second column over. First column being the one with the name in it. So we were looking at this table, and that's how the VLOOKUP worked. It went down the left side until it found Grand Theft Auto 4 exactly, and then it went to the second column and grabbed the 98. You can do a similar thing with HLOOKUP. So VLOOKUP means vertical lookup, where you have your information in column format. So whereas all of the names are listed in one column, so it's a vertical lookup, it's looking up and down. HLOOKUP would be if you had a table like the one I'm highlighting here with the names of the games at the top, and you're looking horizontally across rows instead of vertically. And that's the difference between the HLOOKUP and the VLOOKUP. So same setup. Basically, I'm looking up Grand Theft Auto 4, and this is now Metacritic table 3. I want to pull the second column and false, just to make sure I get an exact match. And we can see that it also pulls 98. This time, pulling it from Metacritic table 3, it finds Grand Theft Auto 4, and then the second row is the value. Next is the match function. This looks up any value and sees if it's within a range. Here, I'll show you a quick example. So we want to match Grand Theft Auto 4 in game list, and 0 is an exact match, so we'll choose that. And let me show you where game list is. So if I click that from the name drop-down box, and if you have any questions about naming ranges, you can see the other video on naming ranges and cells. But we have a range called the game list, which is just the list of games that are in the table. And so it's trying to find out where in the game list is Grand Theft Auto 4, and it is the first one. So if we had a different game in there, it would tell us where in the range, so which number cell in that range. You'll notice that it's B6, but it still returns a 1 because it's the first one in that range. The row function, this can be used to determine the row of something, so we'll pick the row where Grand Theft Auto is. and it's row 6, so the output is 6. You can use row calculations to help when you're filling in like an HLOOKUP, or if you're doing different formulas that require multiple references that vary with where they are on the spreadsheet. You can use the row to signify where you're at, or use the row and minus or add a certain amount so that you can use it as a variable in one of your formulas. But I'll get into that later when we get into more complex formulas. Index. Here, I'll show you how it would work. It's pretty similar to the match function and can be used in conjunction with it. We're going to pick game list, and then it says row number. So basically we're going to say within game list, it's going to ask for a row number and a column number. Since column number's in brackets, it's not required. So for the row number, we're going to pick what the match came up with, so that it should hopefully give us Grand Theft Auto 4, which it does. And index can be used in multiple ways, and you'll see whenever it calls for a row number or column number, you could use the row or column functions in order to make it variable depending on where the formula is being placed. Right now I'm just using single cell examples. Address. This will give you the specific address reference of whichever cells you're referring to. So I'm going to do the address of C62 plus C63. So the number of the match within the range plus the row that range starts at, 6, minus 1, because those both added together would be 7, and we want to be at 6 for our Grand Theft Auto row. If we then do column game list, this would give us the exact address of Grand Theft Auto 4. And the only reason that it's a little bit weird is because when you match, it'll tell you this is the first value, but you actually don't want to be adding 1 to the row in order to get to where you want to be. So that's why we have to do the minus 1. You could have instead taken the row from the start of the table, and then you would not need to do the minus 1. So if you did it from here, that match would spit out how many rows from here you have to be. Maybe a little confusing at first, but once you start using these together, it's a little bit easier. Just to finish off a couple of these other formulas, the VLOOKUP here, just a refresher, if we wanted to do user rank, we would do basically the same thing we did before. Pick Grand Theft Auto to look up. We would do it in the Metacritic table 2. And this time actually the column's going to be 3 because it's the next column over, and we'll do false. And so therefore it'll pull in the user rank. Same with the HLOOKUP formula, which would be off Grand Theft Auto, Metacritic table 3, row 3, and false. Okay, so you may be wondering why I have the pivot data sheet name here, which tells you which sheet it is. That's so we can use it in the indirect function. The indirect function is extremely useful. You can take various pieces of information from other cells and combine it to create a cell reference, which can be very useful if you're dealing with many different types of variables or you want to have your reference be very flexible. So here I will show you how to use the indirect. Basically anything you put in indirect will be jammed together to create a cell reference. So I'm going to concatenate a few things using the ampersand, the addition symbol, to make a cell reference. And so I'm going to refer to, using the address above, B6, I want to refer to that on the pivot data sheet. So in order to do that, I first need an apostrophe. So that is an apostrophe within 2 double quotes. So 5 altogether. I'll just do that slowly. So a regular quotation mark, then an apostrophe, then a quotation mark. And that's because when you reference a sheet, it's an apostrophe, then the sheet name, then an apostrophe, and a exclamation point. So if we take the apostrophe and we add in the pivot data sheet name, and then we also add in within quotes, because anything within quotes is just going to take directly what you type in. We're going to put a apostrophe and an exclamation point and the quotes, and then we're going to add this B6. And so really this should hopefully give us Grand Theft Auto 4, which it does. So you can see that the indirect function worked properly. It added the sheet name and the address to pull us the correct amount. I'm sorry, the correct reference. Let me now show you how the column and rows work. I already used column here, but essentially the column function will take any reference you give it and it'll tell you the numerical value of the column. So if I did G1, it'll tell me 7. And so one easy way to check is to highlight. If you grab from A over to G, you'll see in the top left corner near the name box it says 7C. That means 7 columns, and so you can see that's correct. That also works with rows. You can see right underneath the row amount it says 15 rows, 16 rows, 17 near my mouse as I drag it down. It'll tell you how many you have selected. Also in the bottom right it tells you a lot of information about averages, counts, and other things. If you're highlighting, for example, some numbers, it'll tell you the sum of them, the maximum, the minimum. Then you can change these as well. As a side note. So row works almost the exact same way as column, but with rows. Just to spice up this reference, we'll use the indirect, and we'll do B6. And that'll tell us it's row 6, which it is. Columns with an S. That'll tell you how many columns are in a given range. So Metacritic Table 1 has 4 columns. If we go to Metacritic Table 1, you'll see that there's 4 columns. Same thing with rows. Metacritic Table 1 as well. Why not? It has 27 rows. And so from this 5 all the way down to 31, that's 27 rows. And so that's useful whenever you're trying to extract information about where things are, where the end of a range is, where the beginning of it is, especially if you're going to be using macros and are basing it off of cells within a spreadsheet to tell you what certain references are. Here I'm going to use the row function just to see where the Metacritic Table 1 starts. And so it starts at row 5, just like we mentioned above. And then I'm going to use that number 5, it could be anything, as the example of the offset. So the offset function, first you put in a reference, then a number of rows and columns that you want it to be offset from that reference. So if you put in B6, for example, and you put 1 for rows, it would go to B7. It would add 1. And so here we can put in a reference. What I'm going to use for the reference is this indirect formula here. Just to show you how you can combine formulas. So the reference is the indirect we used up above in cell C66. Number of rows, we'll do this rows before table, it doesn't really matter, and then columns 0. And so this should give us the game in that game list 5 down from Grand Theft Auto 4. And so it says Red Dead Redemption. And if we look at the second sheet, Grand Theft Auto 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is Red Dead Redemption. It knew that we had this reference, and then it offset it by 5 rows. And so that's the main elements of lookup and reference functions. You can combine these in all sorts of different ways with other formulas, including some of the logical ones, like the if statement, to do some really complicated formulas that do a lot for you without you having to do a lot of work besides setting up your data correctly. Thanks for watching, and I look forward to the next lesson.